It's a pleasure to be here again in Dublin and to see that my prejudice about Dublin, that is always rainy, is not true. Okay, so dermatology, as Frank just explained, is really the skill to read and to interpret subtle changes in the skin texture and in the skin color. Look at this, for instance. If you get off this light, you would see it even better. Do you see anything on it? Well, if you would be a dermatologist, you should clearly demarcate the borders between affected and non-affected skin. It's a discrete red, and we don't only see the red, we see the cause. Once we see that, we have the diagnosis. It's erythema migrans, a Borrelia infection of the skin after a tick bite. Now, of course, we also treat it. We don't only diagnose it. Also, Austria has its artists in dermatology. These color paintings and color prints were introduced in the 19th centuries, and actually that's an Austrian lady with the lupus erythematosus of her face from the Atlas of Hebra, which was one of our first professors of dermatology in Austria and in Europe. And Anton Elfinger was the artist, also a dermatologist, but also an artist doing these magnificent paintings. And there were other people who did moulages, so also sculpture was part of dermatology teaching, and you can see this is lupus miliaris of the face, and you see how well people observed and reproduced the signs of skin diseases. But you don't need to be a dermatologist to read and to interpret signs on the skin. All of us are trained from the first days of our life to intuitively read cues of health, age, mood from the skin of the people with whom we interact. And much of this is associated with skin, with color changes of the skin. So what are the components of the different colors of our skin? I had in the title art, so I was looking for at least Dublin-born artist, Francis Bacon. Could not really serve as a good example to depict how artists depicted our skin. So I went back to Michelangelo, and you see in this little group here all the tones which we observe naturally on the skin, of normal skin, of course. That's not diseased skin. And Michelangelo left with this painting not only a very nice depiction of skin, but also, because it's unfinished, the different steps he used to paint skin. And if you see here is a white background, of course, the canvas, which was covered with blank white paint, then a green color to give a background, a staining for the flesh paint, as it was called, and you can see the subtle but not finished the face of Madonna and the finished face here in the surrounding people. And that's Michelangelo, the Manchester Madonna, which he painted in 1497. Like in old paintings, the skin consists of different layers of colors, and they contribute, each of them contributes to the different skin tones. And if we look at our representation of our skin, that's of course from a German lecture I heard, you see the epidermis, the outermost skin layer, the dermis, and the subcutis. And if we look at this part of the dermis, this is made of what we call extracellular matrix. So these are proteins which are really hardy, like collagens, which all of you know, and these protein fibers are arranged like the fibers in a canvas, like the fibers in a tissue. And they provide strength and flexibility to the skin. But what they also do is it forms a background on which the colors, the superimposed colors, develop. And the color of the extracellular matrix by itself, it's a pretty blank white, and this white was used in art for a long time in parchments. That's goat skin or calf skin, and it's not as white as here because that's also bleached, but it's very much comparable with the canvas. And if you want to look at parchment in reality, you go to the Trinity College and you look at the Book of Kells, which is basically which is colored or which is written on parchment. Now, back to the skin. If we go, in contrast to parchment, of course, skin is viable tissue. Viable tissue needs nourishment. Nourishment is provided by skin vessels, and they are abundant in the skin. Especially, there's different layers of very small vessels, capillaries. You see them here in the cut, you see them here in the skin. And these capillaries of our skin comprise approximately 20 kilometers of tubes. And of course, speaking of physiology, they regulate our blood pressure, they regulate our heat, and they contract if we are in the cold, you're getting pale, and they open if you're in the heat, and that's the action of the capillaries. And that's what you see if you look from the outside in. That's approximately a square centimeter, sorry, not a square centimeter, that's probably 3-4 square millimeters of your skin, whatever part you take. And if you look at 1 square millimeter, that's how it looks like. So these capillaries have a physiological function, blood pressure, heat, or body temperature, but they have, of course, also a non-physiological kind of aesthetic function. And if you look at this picture of Gainsborough, you see that these cheeks, well, they're looking better here than on the projection. The cheeks are really come out pink. They signal youth. And of course, everybody wants to look young, and that's another function of our skin, to serve as a canvas for colors which we put, or some of us put on the skin. Here, in this case, to imitate desirable aspects of skin physiology. In others, to give the impression to be different, to differentiate themselves from other people around them. But it seems to be that doing a very old art, I brought this from a very old Austrian, from the Iceman, which was found at the Austrian-Italian borders and was 5,000 years ago where he died. And he has more than 50 of those tattoos, and nobody knows what they signify on his skin. Are they just decorative, or do they have any mystical, mythological significance? Now, if we go too far with the desirable aspects of skin physiology, we might end up again with the skin disease. Here, Frank and myself were discussing whether this is really a perioral dermatitis, like it was written in our books, or whether it's first flush of rosacea. But anyway, you see here we have physiology and pathology pretty close together. Now, going back to this lady, is there a rationale why facial makeup is so widespread in the different cultures? Africa, India, everywhere you find makeup abundant. And Richard Russell from Gettysburg did very interesting experiment. So if you look at these two faces, decide for yourself whom of them you judge female and whom of them you judge male. Most of you will probably come up with this being the female face. And actually, both faces are completely artificial. The only change between the two faces, which are otherwise completely identical, is that the contrasts between lips and surrounding skin and between the eyelids and the surrounding skin has been altered. So the cues we are getting with regard to femininity are really cues of not only colors, but the differences of colors, the differences of tones, and the contrasts which we have in our face. So there is a reason to do makeup, and because it's really increasing the contrasts of lips and eyes with regard to the surrounding skin. By the way, those of you who are interested in that, Richard Russell really published a work on the contrasts, facial contrasts, which diminish with age around mouth and surrounding skin, and eyebrows and surrounding skin. So there is a reason to do some painting in the face for many, at least half of the population. So this is a very old piece of art from a grave of Sethos I, about 1,300 years before our time, and it depicts different skin colors. And of course, these are not due to neither extracellular matrix, not due to vascularization, but they are just due to pigment which is produced in the skin by very specialized cells. You have them here, they lie within the epidermis, and they have this form. You see, they have dendrites, and they are, as we call them, they are dendritic. Now what they do is they produce a pigment called melanin, and this pigment is produced in little powerhouses within the cells, which are called melanosomes, which are light and then on maturation become darker and darker. We refer to them as stage 1 to stage 4 melanosomes. And the melanocyte doesn't produce that just for itself. It produces it, and as you can see here, again, we have the melanocyte with this dendrite, and what you see here in red and blue are cells which are in direct vicinity, directly surrounding the melanocytes, and they are in physical contact. And what the melanocyte does, the melanocyte transfers actively these melanosomes into the keratinocytes, so into the cells which form the outer barrier of our skin. And it's not just randomly distributed within these keratinocytes. That's a section through the skin. You see here the epidermis, you see the extracellular matrix and cells of the dermis, and you see pigment here. This brown spot is pigment. And the pigment is just like a little head above the genetic material of the basal keratinocytes. So that's the genetic material that needs to be protected. I'm always puzzled by how beautifully this functions, because melanin protects against insults coming from outside in the form of UV light. And with regard to skin color, it's not the numbers of these producing cells, it's the maturation steps and the forms of these little organelles of the melanosomes. In lightly pigmented skin, they are not as mature as in darkly pigmented skin, so they are stage 1, 2, 3 versus stage 4. They are smaller and they lie in groups, whereas in darkly pigmented skin, they are bigger, stay alone, and they are much more abundant. So there's 20 of those in lightly pigmented and 200 of those in darkly pigmented skin. And they are, the darkly pigmented skin melanosomes are degraded slower. So it's another form, another reason why this difference is due to melanin pigment. Now, as dermatologists, we are confronted with situations where melanocytes do not behave as they should. They go bad, and they form skin tumors, very aggressive skin tumors called melanomas. They are amongst the most aggressive tumors we know, because once they have a certain size, they tend to metastasize. And the thing is that early detection of such melanomas can lead to cure, because removal at a very early stage decreases the risk of melanoma, dying from melanoma to zero. And what we have there and what we use in dermatology, we have a grading scale, so a scale where we distinguish between normal pigment spots or moles on our skin surface and spots which have a higher risk of being malignant. We call it the ABC criteria: asymmetry, border color, and diameter. I put it in because of the color differences which might occur in a melanoma. Now, I'm not showing that to encourage non-dermatologists to diagnose a melanoma. It's just I want you to keep in mind that dermatologists are able to read that and are able to prevent probably to prevent a disease progression or prevent a disease at all. And here is such an example of two spots you have here. This one and on the shoulder, and this one in a different person on the neck, and you can guess what it is. And one is a superficial spreading melanoma, the one here, and one is a conventional mole. Both of them have been excised. What happens if there is no pigment produced in our skin? Actually, it happens sometimes that individuals have not that capability to produce pigment due to the lack of an enzyme called tyrosinase, and these are people with an albinism. And there you can see the color of the skin and the skin appendages in its non-pigmented form. It's yellowish, whitish hair, blue eyes, and yellowish, whitish eyelashes, and the pink, rosy skin. That's the vessel from before. Now, it's not a major trouble for the person if the person lives in Ireland, but if the same disease or if the same occurs in Africa, it's a problem, because there it shows what happens if no pigment is there. You see this young lady here with her mother who has obviously skin cancer developed at a very early age. So the pigment is really there not to embellish. The pigment is there to protect, and to protect against skin cancer due to UV light. This was from a National Geographic article published in 2013. Now, the International Dermatology Foundation and the International League of Dermatological Societies has an activity in Tanzania, in Moshi. And why there? Because Tanzania is a hotspot of albinos. So for a reason which is not completely known, 1 in 1,400 people are born as albinos with this mutation, whereas in the rest of the world is 1 in 20,000. And what is even worse is that in the culture, in the regional culture, especially on the countryside, albinos have been believed to be ghosts, to be haunted, to be cursed, and body parts have been traded and are still traded magic potions promising prosperity and healing. Now, there's educational programs which are supported by the ILDS and the IDF, and if you're IFD, and if you're interested, go to these websites and look whether you help support these programs. The EADV does also participate in these activities. Now, the melanin is complicated because it doesn't exist only in one simple form, but it exists in two different forms. It exists as eumelanin, which is more brown, black, and as pheomelanin, which is more reddish. Now, the ratio between the two, so most of us produce both melanins, but the ratio between the two determines our skin tone and our hair color, and associated with that, our susceptibility to UV exposure. And you see here, if you have many eumelanosomes, they look like that, more oval shaped, you will be more with the darker skin, with darker hair, whereas if you have more pheomelanosomes, it will be more into the blonde or reddish direction. And the most important mechanism that regulates that is a hormone which is produced in the brain, but also in the skin locally, which is called melanocyte stimulating hormone, and this binds to a receptor, melanocortin receptor, which is on the pigment producing cells, also on other cells, but on the pigment producing cells, it has the job to keep in equilibrium the eumelanin black-brown pigment and the pheomelanin red pigment. And if there is a mutation in this receptor, the equilibrium is shifted. The equilibrium is shifted to more pheomelanin production. More of the red pigment is produced if this interaction between receptor doesn't work. And what you end up with is what we call Celtic phenotype. So red hair, freckles, very light skin. And of course, I don't have to tell that in Ireland, because this mutation is rather, mutations in this receptor, there's several mutations are rather prevalent. But just, Jonathan Rees always tells the story on selection of red hair, pale skin individuals, and I don't know where he has the data from, but apparently on the Roman slave market, women with red hair and pale skin had higher prices. So one of the selection criteria. But if you look in art, there's many paintings who depict red-haired individuals, red-haired women, and usually they're revolutionary, like Jeanne d'Arc here from Dante Gabriel Rossetti, or Danae from Gustav Klimt from a private collection in Graz, and of course the picture you saw before, Vincent van Gogh, who had the self-portrait, and he's also a MC1R mutant, one could say. The thing is, and I tell this to the ladies, and I tell this here, especially in Ireland, because it might be an advice which is helpful. This is from a study we published in 2010 in a scientific journal, and what you see here is these two ladies have the same age. They're controlled for confounding factors, same sun exposure, etc. One has pretty severe photoaging, as you can see here with pigment irregularities and wrinkles. The other one looks not as much photoaged, and the difference between these two ladies is simply a mutation in this gene. So in this melanocortin receptor gene, so everybody who has this position should, in addition to protecting him or herself against skin cancer, also try to avoid sun or protect himself against sun because of the increased rate of aging. Now, if we look of skin colors worldwide, we come up with pretty diverse skin tones. And the question is, the basic mechanism is the same. Melanocytes produce melanin, and well, there's different melanins. Why do we have so many different shades ranging from very dark to very light skin? And if we look at the native populations, data which were collected prior to 1940, we have the proof, which we know, of course, also already from school, that their skin color distribution is much of very dark skin in Africa, southern India, Australia. The further you go north, the further the lighter becomes your skin. Now, you had Nina Jablonski not long a time ago who spoke about these evolutionary aspects of our skin color. So I'm just reviewing a few slides of this evolutionary aspects of our skin color. Now, the further you go, so this was the time when humans, humanoids, went out of Africa, and you see Europeans, Asians, what they develop is quite a lot of different mutations in different in genes which are associated with pigmentation. So the question is, what is the driving force for the changes in skin color or differences in skin color? In generally, a driving force of evolution is an environmental factor. And for the skin, the most important environmental factor, of course, is UV light, as we just saw from the previous slides. Now, sun is the environmental factor which has a strong impact on our skin. If we think of sun, we have, of course, as doctors, we think of sunburns, we think of photoaging, we think of skin tumors. And actually, if you make the whole list what sun does, and you end up with a lot of negative things, from photoallergies to phototoxicity to skin cancer, gene mutations, etc. But there is one thing, of course, which is not so bad, and this is the vitamin D synthesis. Sunlight is essential to trigger the first step from dehydroxycholesterol to provitamin D, and this occurs in our skin through UV irradiation. And I don't have to tell you that that vitamin D deficiency leads to rickets, basically osteomalacy, to bone deformities, and this was enough to explain a lot why this would be an evolutionary pressure. Only in the last 10 years it became apparent that vitamin D is a critical factor in our defense against bacterial infections, in particular against mycobacterial infections. And there's now trials going on that combine tuberculostatic treatments with vitamin D, and this has improved outcomes. And vitamin D deficiency makes people more susceptible to infections. So strongly pigmented skin needs longer UV exposure than light pigmented skin to produce the same amount of vitamin D. So this is certainly a difference, a physiological difference between light and dark skin. And the second factor, sun, skin, and metabolism, is UV irradiation can, and UV, not only UVB, but also UVA, can destroy folic acid, which is a building stone for nucleic acid, which is an essential is an essential part of our bodily functioning. And if you have a folic acid deficiency, you would have, as an adult, normally an anemia. But if you are pregnant, you might your baby might have malformations, and if you're a man, you might have an impaired spermatogenesis. So both factors which influence evolution, because it gives a disadvantage to the person who is exposed to that. So basically, we have strongly pigmented skin, is much better protected against folic acid degradation upon UV exposure than lightly pigmented skin. Now, in the conclusion of that is the evolution of skin color in the different areas is most likely, in science you never say 100%, but because it's difficult to prove an evolutionary process which goes over 50,000 years, a consequence of keeping the balance between the beneficial effects of UV light, so vitamin D synthesis, and the negative effects, folic acid degradation by UV light. And if you look now at this table, which probably Nina Jablonski showed because it's from one of her papers a few years ago, what you see here is 3 areas. So no points, few points, many points. In this area, a light or medium light pigmented person would have no problem 100% of the year enough vitamin D would be produced, whereas the further you go north here, you have 1 month in this area, so that would cover Italy, Spain, etc. You have at least 1 month a year where not enough sun exposure is present to produce enough amounts of vitamin D. And if you go further up to Ireland or to Scandinavia, you have several months of the year where the UV level is not sufficient to produce adequate amounts of vitamin D. So from this, it is understandable that the further you go north into the area where there is not enough sun exposure, the lighter your skin must be to have the same output on vitamin D to protect you against bone deformities and against infection as you would have if you would stay in equatorial area. So that's the most likely explanation for the vitamin, for the different skin colors. So these two layers here, these two maps are really superposable, because the areas where there is highest sun exposure are really corresponding very much to the areas where people with dark skin live, with the exception, of course, here with South America, where there is not, although a big UV exposure, a strong UV exposure, skin is not as dark as you would find it in southern India or in Africa or in Australia. But the explanation for that might be that the time to come to the United States, to America, and then go down to South America was not enough to revert this evolutionary pressure which has been exerted during the time when we went out of Africa. So going back to one of the other advantages, I just want to mention that again, that the skin color and non-melanoma skin cancer, so all the skin cancer which is not the pigment type of skin cancer, is much higher in lightly pigmented skin, 232 per 100,000 cancers per 100,000 inhabitants per year, as compared to 4 per 100,000 inhabitants per year in the United States, who usually have very good epidemiological data. Now the question is, what happens if a light-skinned individual migrates to areas of high insolation? This was the case. It's a natural experiment. What you have here is you have Irish or British, Scottish people who went or were sent to Australia, and from the skin viewpoint, what happened, of course, was first a sunburn. That's a person who has, as you can see, one of the MC1R mutation was too long in the sun. But what happened on the long run is, and these are data from the Cancer Council of Australia, that skin cancer in Australia accounts for 80% of all newly diagnosed cancers, and they are caused basically by the exposure to the sun of individuals who have a genetic makeup which was not made to be in this area of the world. And the incidence in Australia is the highest, one of the highest in the world, 2 to 3 times higher than in Canada, UK, or in the US. Now, the last part, very shortly, is, has to do with color differences between sexes. So if you go back, like in this case, 2,000 years before our time, you find a depiction of a couple, Prince Rahotep and his wife Nofret, who are exposed, who are in exposition in Egypt Museum in Cairo. And you see dark-skinned guy and a very light-skinned girl. You don't have to go that far, because also in, I hope you see that, in this painting of Lucas Cranach of Adam and Eve, the man is more pigmented than the woman and more pronounced. You see that here in Albrecht Dürer's depiction of the same theme, Adam and Eve in Prado, and you see the darker male and the lighter female. And even in the 20th century, Adam and Eve by Kirchner, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, were depicted in different skin tones, in different skin colors. So we did a study on that, not particularly on that, but really on phototype distribution, etc. And we can confirm that there is a difference between phototypes in women and men. If you look at this data here, 50% have a lighter phototype 3b, whereas 40% of men have the phototype 3b, whereas the phototype 4 is here in 29% of women only and 42% of men. So it's an objective feature in the same ethnic group. There is a difference between men and women, and I did not find out, and these were pretty big numbers, 3,000, more than 3,000 in each group. I didn't find out why this is the case, but probably something for the future. Perhaps it's just to increase what we discussed before, the facial, the contrasts, because if your skin is paler, the contrasts come out better, or perhaps our judgment of femininity is just due to a natural difference in skin color between men and women. So why I'm mentioning that is because perhaps there's a young researcher here in the room who wants to make this as a theme for his her future studies, this difference in skin color still awaits explanation and exploration. So to come to an end, I'll want to show you what we went through on the canvas of our dermis, on our extracellular matrix. We have a pigment which gives color to our skin. We have vessels, which capillaries, which add a different, an additional color, and which, being dynamic, makes us even interact via the skin with our with people who we are interacting with. And if we put that together, we end up with the skin tone we are used to see in paintings and we used to see in the people we see all day long. And of course, they have hair. In this case, we can see after what we have heard that apparently this lady also has a mutation in her melanocortin receptor. And for the man, be aware, things can happen. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, please just address it via email to me. Thank you.